when you are a leader, you do not get to do many reps rapidly. And usually if you are getting to do a lot of reps, it's because things are going crazy. You can't really tell what worked and what didn't. It went badly. Well, was that because of stuff inside my control, outside of my control? I don't really know. Producers, one of our jobs is to make sure we're all going in the same direction. And so when you see that dichotomy of, hey, I think you're going in a different direction than what players expect, I'm not saying you have to not do that. I am saying you need to acknowledge that. Most individuals do not put the same priority on that people management as they do on the rest of their responsibilities. And partially that's because they're incentivized to do everything else, not the people management. Welcome to the first Building Better Games Q&A episode. I fielded a set of questions from our Building Better Games Discord, and today we're going to be talking about leadership, knowing when you're on the right track in game development, and production generally, as well as some other questions that popped up that were pretty interesting. Many thanks to the people who asked these questions. I'm really excited to answer them. I'm excited to do this generally overall. So let's get into it. Okay, question 1. I would love a production angle on my favorite game dev question. How do you ensure that you, the royal you, are making a game that will be fun for players, not just fun for its designers to make? Or maybe in this context, what are the ways in which production can support product management and ensure the sprint goals align with what internal player advocates are asking for? So I do see this as two separate questions. Let's deal with this first one. How do you ensure that you, the royal you, are making a game that will be fun for players, not just fun for its designers to make? So what you're going for here is, how do we know it's going to be a good game? And that our designers aren't crazy, and that they don't just have this big idea in their head that's not going to work out. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think you can. The word ensure, how do you ensure it? You can't. Or at least I don't know a way to. I don't know anybody that does know a way to. The reality is that every game that's hit it out of the water, there were people that weren't sure it was going to. There were people that were 100% committed, and plenty of games that have totally bombed had people strongly believing that they were going to be the most successful thing ever, that they were going to land and change the world of gaming. So I don't think you can ensure this. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And so when I think about what can you do, how does it say, make sure that you're making a game that will be fun for players, really a game that's going to engage players, that's going to be, in my mind, I am extending on this question a little bit, but commercially viable, perhaps even critically successful. We get those out of order a lot, but the commercially viable then critically successful is a better priority than critically successful and then commercially viable. Even being unable to guarantee it, you should still be doing your darndest to have a good idea that players are going to find it fun, that they will be engaging with the game, that they will be drawn into it. And the way you do that, honestly, I feel like I'm a broken record sometimes when I say this because I say it a lot. You get it in front of them as fast as possible. You get it in front of real players. Yes, have playtests inside your studio. You're probably going to start there. Yes, do friends and family. All those people are going to be biased in terrible ways that will limit the effectiveness of their feedback. If that's all you can get, do it. And especially because you can do it very early, do that. Get to first playable stuff. Get to things that test, that slice your experience into pieces somehow. Get prototypes out that you can mess with and put in front of people, and then do that. And see what happens, and see what kind of response you get. Just because you do one prototype and everybody doesn't get it yet, that doesn't mean you have to give up, but it is informative that something needs to change. And so that's the path you want to walk down when you're trying to ensure that players will actually find the game fun. It's not just something that designers enjoy doing. I think there's other things you can do around, thinking about which designers you hire. What is their focus? Are they trying to build the game that they always wanted to make, or are they trying to make something that is a success that players are going to love and engage with and want to pay money for, that see a lot of value in? You want to balance that. You want to balance your hiring, or focus your hiring more on the side of the people that are wanting to make the great game for the players, not just the great game that I always wanted to make. So those are a couple of things. to focus on. Get in contact with players early, get in contact with players often. The second part of this question, what are the ways in which production can support product management and ensure the sprint-to-sprint goals align with what internal player advocates are asking for? So how do you know what players are thinking outside of things like playtests? Well, I am a huge proponent of involving QA heavily very early in development all the way through development. Doesn't mean you need like a 100-person QA team in ideation or something, but you want people there representing the QA voice very early on, and also just banging away at the game, because they're going to have an experience of what it's like to play this over and over and over, and you want that experience. It's hard to replicate that in doing some play tests, especially early on. So, internal play tests, you can kind of get some of that, but QA, man, they're going to be slamming their heads against that game and really their job is to find all the little edge cases and exploits and bugs and blah, blah, blah. And so they will have a lot of information about, like, are they enjoying any of that? Is it a fun game to QA, or at least not a horrible game to QA, or is it like pulling teeth every time they go in? Another place to go is I encourage, depending on the type of game you're making, but often setting up communities early and then engaging with community managers of some sort. This is probably not super early in development, but at some point you're going to want to start setting up your community and have people, even as a secondary role, engaging with the community about, how that audience that you've got, how the community that you've got is responding to what you're talking about, to the trailers that you're putting out, to gameplay updates or patch notes or, milestone shares, whatever you're doing with that community to help keep them engaged and excited about what will eventually be there. And hopefully they're actually also helping to test your game. You want to be talking to those community managers about what they're seeing. Are people coming into that community and sticking around and excited? Are they, when they do a play test, are they coming back for another one? How many people are... No, I think I'll pause it there. I think I'll just say those two things. So community managers can be very helpful. Watching your community can be helpful. And again, these are all just ways that you're staying in touch with the players, and community managers and QA. QA are the closest thing you have to players inside the studio, and community managers are the most in touch with your community as it grows. So yeah, think about those things when you're thinking about sticking with the fun. Now, production plays a role in this, in that if you ever feel like there's a disconnect between the QA voice as player and the community manager voice for that community, for the players that you hopefully will eventually have, that isn't getting through to product leaders or designers who are kind of off in the clouds building something fancy. Producers, one of our jobs is to make sure we're all going in the same direction. And so when you see that dichotomy of, hey, I think you're going in a different direction than what players expect, I'm not saying you have to not do that. I am saying you need to acknowledge that. And you let me know that is very deliberate and that you think that's going to work out. And I want to know how you're going to test that, because every time I see us going off thinking like, well, we've got a way better idea and the players are all misinformed or whatever, you might be right. How are we going to know, and how are we going to know quickly? Because the longer we run down the wrong path, the harder it is to change direction, the more expensive that mistake is. So producers need to be there helping bring that team together to point in the same direction. And when QA is telling you one thing and your designers or product thinkers are telling you to go or driving you in a different direction, you should be paying attention to that. And producers should be figuring out how to resolve that issue. All right. So question 2 from Philip. What would you say needs to happen to make the big players more competitive / successful again? How/why do you think many recent major, meaning mostly costly releases missed the mark in terms of financial success? Are the big corporations out of touch with their player base? Or are we just at a point where we need to realize player numbers and hours spent are a finite resource? Consequently, do we need to drastically change the type and process of game making to address and include those who today don't identify as gamers? Or are the big productions of today just too costly? As a producer at Ubi, actually, I'll skip that last part. So we'll end with editors. We'll end with, are the big productions of today just too costly? Oh, that's a bunch of questions all wrapped into one. I think the first one is the one that sort of captures all of it. What would you say needs to happen to make the big players more competitive and successful again? Okay, so why aren't they successful today? I'm gonna see if I can draw this out a little bit. So let's say there's a line, and this is a dollar line, and this is time. And we have a red line, which is our expenses, how expensive things are. And we have a green line, which is how much revenue we generate from the game that we've produced. Now, depending on the game, you're going to see different types of revenue lines. For something like a Baldur's Gate 3, it probably looks something like this. And hopefully you get some kind of long tail, and if you ever were to do a patch, you might get a bump. Maybe it would go higher, whatever. For something like a, what you're going to see is, when it's successful, you're going to see something like this, where you get growth, and then sometimes you get extra spikes, and then eventually you start leveling off. And maybe even you dip eventually, and you might come back, and then you'll start playing around, and you'll figure out, what's going on. So, let's make a red line. Red line is the cost to make the game. So let's take this League of Legends line. Now, when League of Legends first began, more money was invested in it than was made by it. That lasted for a very short amount of time. But as the game was exploding, costs did slowly start to go up. And it's really hard as companies grow and scale for costs not to continue to go up. And so you try to control that cost, but they still kind of continue to go up. And then you end up like laying off a bunch of people, but as soon as you stop, the costs continue to go up again. And the problem emerges when the red line hits the green line. This is very bad. What this means is you are now spending more money to continue making whatever it is you're doing, to run the company, than you're making from the game that funds the company. In many games, the big ones, this is a hard thing to avoid. You want to try to keep the red line from going up and hitting the green line, but costs tend to go up over time. Salaries go up, how many people, player expectation goes up, a lot of things go up, 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 up. And you see this with a lot of games. This is made worse in game development because there has been an unbelievable increase in how expensive it is to make games over the last 15 years. The cost of making games, so again, I kind of use this same chart for this. So the cost of making games, if you have pretend this is some number of millions, has just gone from it was pretty low actually, and it's just been skyrocketing up, the cost to make games, because teams are larger, salaries are bigger, dev cycles have become, no longer do you expect to make a AAA product in a couple years. It's going to could take you half a decade, it could take you 7 or 8 years, and that whole time you might be funding, not 5 people or 10 people, but you're probably at 40 or 50 or 70 or 150 people. And that's really, really, really expensive. And the sort of napkin math I use, if you're using US developers that are living on sort of West Coast hotspots or places where a lot of game dev companies are, you're somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 per person per year. That's kind of how I look at okay, here's an approximation of what the dev cost burn rate is. This doesn't count marketing, but this is just dev cost burn rate over time. It's not that that's the average salary. It's that when you add in all of their expenses, it kind of nets out to something like that. And so you have this line where not that long ago, we were actually it wasn't that expensive to make a game. And what you had was and again, these numbers are wrong. I don't know exactly where we are in this. What you had was, hey, our average return, even though most games failed, some were hugely successful, but our average return was something up here. But the problem is our average return has still gone up. Game dev is still a successful industry that's growing from a profitability, a revenue over time perspective. But unfortunately, this happened. And again, you have this problem. When the green line and the red line meet, and the red line is going up faster, you have a serious issue. And games have experienced this today. Big studios are running into this as an issue, where $30 million used to be a AAA game. Now you're looking at least $100 million is what, a AAA game looks like. And many are far, far, far higher than that. I've heard ridiculous numbers for certain products. And again, these are out there on the internet, but I saw some article that said GTA 6 was going to cost $2 billion. GTA 6 will probably be profitable despite the fact that it may cost that much. But it's not just dev spend, it's marketing spend. Like, so you put all this together. Making games has gotten really expensive, and the revenues you get from them are, while still going up overall, aren't going up at the same rate as the costs are going up. And now studios are having to contend with that. Okay, so to come back to the original question, what do I think needs to happen for big players to become more competitive and successful again? So one thing I would say is that large game dev companies have largely figured out how to build a game that works, which is actually an improvement. I think generally, like we have the tools now, and actually I wouldn't even say it's the AAA companies. In some sense, it's the engines and the tech and the foundational stuff, the all the third party things that really come together to provide all that you need to build a game. And you still have to do it, and it's still very difficult, but there are major releases now that come out that actually work pretty well at launch, and they're not bad games by any sort of historical standard. But they fail. Nobody chooses to play them. That's kind of a new thing. Not totally new. That always happened to some extent. But to have like a good or even like, oh, that's a pretty fun game, and to have it just die. The market is becoming incredibly crowded, and the big companies are the most impacted by this, because the reason their teams are so big, the reason they spend so long in development, is because the expectations that everybody has from them are insanely high. Primarily, just in investors and their own sort of, we want to maintain our status as, people who make amazing games. But there's also the publishers and stuff like that. But there's also the players. The players want more and bigger and better, and especially from these large studios. And so you're trying to meet this ever-rising player demand, but we don't have the sort of technological increases in visual fidelity or other things that we had 20 years ago. Our massively increasing visual fidelity doesn't give you the same practical gains that it used to. And so what you have is a lot of large companies that are spending a lot of money trying to make everything look bigger, better, whatever, and just realizing that all the gain I might be making in making this a cooler game is lost in the larger team and the longer time to make it. Sorry, this is getting to be a really long answer. What does it mean to make them more competitive again? So for me, it's actually to push against the idea that the most important things that we do in game development is building all the pieces. For a game to succeed, and especially for it to really hit it out of the park, which is what every game is trying to do, everybody needs to come together to create something that is far greater than the sum of the parts. If you and we've seen this, we've seen games by major studios or publishers that have come out that they have good art, they have good engineering, they have good design. Every individual piece is good, and yet the game isn't. And you see the other thing where sometimes everything feels kind of mediocre, but it all comes together just right. And just the right stuff is good. The art's okay. League of Legends was like this when it first launched. The art was pretty bad. The UI around the game was a disaster. But the design was really good, and the player focus was really good, and the price point of free was really good. And that thing took off in a market that was actually a blue ocean at that time. Now, because it exists, and many other games like it exist, it's no longer a blue ocean. That's the other thing too. The space is becoming more crowded generally. But you end up with these problems of we're focusing heavily on making sure everybody's always doing stuff in these large studios, and not that what we're building is actually coming together to create a compelling experience. And this is where some of the things I've advocated for: stop making big plans with giant feature lists and game design docs that say all the different things you're going to do, and then just sending everybody out to go build every bit of it and then try to plug it all together and hope that works. Instead, build something small, see if it works. Do that with a small team. and let that team work together for a long period of time. They're going to mess up a lot early on just because humans don't naturally come together and collaborate well for the most part. So give them time to figure each other out, and they're going to fail while they're doing that some, and that's okay. That's why you keep it somewhat small to start, and then over time you're going to slowly expand that. But it's going to be based on the idea, what's engaging about the game, why the game is good. When that's all coming together, now you can start moving forward and seeing if like, okay, cool, now we can invest more money and time into this. I think we focus heavily on stuff and not on that value, not on like, did we engage the player? Did we create the experience we were trying to create? And this applies if you're making a live service game. This applies if you're making a narrative game or, a strategy game, whatever it is. That core idea of, does somebody who's playing this, similar to the first question, want to keep playing it? Do we think it's actually a compelling experience? Or are we just throwing a bunch of stuff together? Are we hiring tons of artists and getting external developers and outsourcers to build us all this different stuff and then hoping that everything comes together because, man, if we only have that last feature, it's all going to click in? That's rarely the case. Usually you can much more cheaply figure out if you have a good idea, and you should. And once you realize you do or don't, that's when you invest more money. So I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse on this, as the big game studios are often doing this. And when that doesn't work, what they're then doing is retreating into sequels and to the known. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with making sequels. If you've got a great game and everybody wants a sequel to it, you should go make a sequel to it. It's likely to be highly successful. You're likely to be make a bunch of money on it. You need those things to keep your studio going. I'm not against that at all. It's just that when you're then going and trying to do new game dev, if you apply those same tools and those same concepts, ideas, processes, systems, bureaucracy that creates good sequels over time or sustains a live game through patches or expansions or whatever, that's not the same type of game development as trying to create something brand new. And we're seeing this just over and over and over again as the large companies, I think, focus more on let's get through the plan and less on, is this actually a good game? And I think the tragedy of this is, I guarantee in every single one of those failures, there was way more than one person inside of those studios for the big failures that have happened over the last 4 or 5 years that knew it was going to be a failure, that said, like, this isn't working, this isn't coming together. And they were told, just keep doing it, keep doing your job, like, stick to the plan. That's not how you create amazing things in the knowledge workspace, which is where games live. That's not how novel and innovative breakthroughs happen, which is what we're trying to do in games. You can't just stick to the plan. You have to be paying attention to what's actually happening. So, yeah, my opinion is AAA can make these adjustments theoretically. I don't know if they can practically, because that takes an incredibly brave leader sticking their neck out and attempting to change the cultural and the established culture and the established processes that are how that company succeeds. Many of these companies have a way of working that has become over time hostile to new game development. This sort of gates and checkpoints and the way that they want everything to look and the reports that they ask for from game teams and all this different stuff have been oriented around their successful products. Those successful products are now largely sequels, and when you apply them into the novel space, they don't work as well. Are you willing to adjust? Something I've heard, this was actually something a senior producer told me over a decade ago, and I really think it's a good idea. I don't know how exactly to pull it off, but imagine if you're a giant publisher or studio that with a good reputation, you're considered AAA, but you want to be playing in those novel spaces. Instead of trying to create an R&D team that has to sit within your structure, take a bunch of people, fund a new company, and I put that in quotes, have them be separate from where you are, and from based on how they perform, reabsorb them once they've created something that's amazing. But let them run without the constraints and gates and systems that you're going to use to help make sure your sequels and serve it like live service support style stuff is successful. Let them run and mess up and screw up. And if it doesn't work, you can always reabsorb them into your company. They would have learned valuable things, or you can give them more money to try again. The problem with anything that's in the R&D and creation of novelty space is you can't guarantee it's going to happen. And I think that's a big issue, is that in the olden days, like when, 15 years ago, the olden days, if one game hit it off, it paid for the 5 or 6 that didn't. Now we're getting to the point where you need almost every game to hit it off because of how expensive a AAA production is. If any of them don't, that's a danger. And so if you don't have something that's just an amazing breakout success that returns 10x what you made, and 10x now is much harder than 10x was when prices were a tenth what they were now to build a AAA product. If you don't have a couple things hit at that huge level, you can't fund the new stuff. And so you end up in this situation again, you retreat into the known. So I see that a lot in AAA. I think we're going the wrong way. It makes sense, but we're going the wrong way in terms of taking our whole organizations backwards. And we should instead be focusing on yes, build the sequels, know how to do that well. Keep making the things that players want to play and that will be profitable. No fault in that at all. If you've got a game that just prints money, keep printing money because you're getting that hopefully because players love it. So this isn't a knock against your Call of Duties or your World of Tanks or whatever. But at the same time, that is a path towards eventual stagnation. Possibly. Counter-Strike is still going 25 years later. Maybe it's not. Maybe you can just run that infinitely. I doubt it, though. So if you still want to be doing new game development, you have to figure out the different systems that run. And I think in both environments, you should be focusing much more on value and much less on just creation of more stuff and scale of team and, get smashing your way through production gates and timelines. I actually think you see this more, even though they tend to go towards a more known product market fit. Some of the Japanese studios, I think, are much better at holding the line on we're not shipping when the timeline is over. We're shipping when it's ready, and we accept that means we might make lower ROI, but over the long term, this is going to play out better for us to actually spend the time we need to get this where it needs to be. Where I feel like in the West, we're more prone to try to crunch the team, grind it out, get everything done by a particular date and hope it works. All right, let me just run through the rest of these questions real quick. Missed the mark in terms of financial success. Okay, I talked about that. I think it's because cost has gone up, revenue hasn't gone up as fast. As well, the obsession with stuff over value. Big corporations out of touch with their player base. Somewhat. I do think there's a disconnect between... I do not like how adversarial some studios or publishers seem to be with their players. That's a problem. That's your audience. You're serving them. You need to understand them. You need to treat them well. And acting like they're idiots is bad. And I think sometimes I've seen that. But that's not everybody. Are we just at a point where we need to realize player numbers and hours spent are a finite resource? Yeah, but I mean, that's always been somewhat true. I do think that the limitations of hours spent through games that have sustained now for like 5 or plus years, eating up so much of the market. So most of the people spend most of their time playing games that have already existed for a long time, either through being live service games or being sequels of things like a World of Tanks for the live service side or Warframe or something like that, or a Call of Duty as sort of the ultimate, like, hey, we just keep producing a sequel to this, sequel to this, sequel to this. That's eating up a lot more time than it used to. We don't live in a world where you buy a game, you play it, and then you finish it, and then you buy another game. You may play the same game for years. Okay, so do we need to drastically change the type and process? Talked about that. Are big productions of today just too costly? Yes, I think they are. And I think, again, the way we get through that is by keeping teams smaller and focusing on value more than stuff. I don't think we need to start addressing people who don't identify as gamers necessarily. I guess it depends on who you are and what exactly you mean by that. There's a lot of gamers out there. They're looking for great games. If you make a great game, they're going to be happy to play it if they can find it. So I think that's also a part of this, is like you have a two-step problem now, but the big companies have less of an issue with discoverability. Still, you can still, I think, make a mess of your marketing, but broadly, it's the smaller, it's the AA indie, like AA single A indie stuff that's going to struggle more with discoverability. Okay, so I feel like I've answered that question sufficiently. That was a very long answer. delete the board. Boop. All right. Okay, this is another question from Kevin. This is question number 3. Do you think there's an observable trend towards an increased amount of co-development as a way to mitigate costs and risk? What issues do you see this posing for coherent design and production if there is an increasing reliance on external development partners? Two questions again. Okay, do you think there's an observable trend towards an increased amount of co-development as a way to mitigate costs and risk? Yes, absolutely. And why? Actually, let me just undo what I just did. You see these lines? So if, let me get back in here. Okay, so if I hire Western developers, this is what my line looks like. If I hire people from less expensive parts of the world, this is what my line looks like when it comes to how expensive it is to make that game over time. The higher the percentage of my people that I pay in less expensive parts of the world if everything else was equal, which it is not, and we'll get to that, then I prefer line 2 over line 1. And so co-development is popular right now, and especially in parts of the world where it's less expensive to live and you don't have to pay people as much. And for a lot of these companies that are based in the United States or other very expensive parts of the world, going to somewhere like Eastern Europe or South America and paying a significantly lower wage for an engineer or an artist or whatever, this is like, yay, we're winning, like check mark. Green, we love it, it's cheaper, right? Now, I think that's one reason it's happening. I think another one is it allows you to keep the local team size small, and I actually like that quite a bit. So I am a fan sometimes of keeping your core team very small, and whenever you need something that core team can't provide, you go to an external developer or an outsourcer or a contract. There are also legal things that are easier to do with contractors than they are to do with full-time employees. You feel less of a need to vet them. It's especially in some parts of the world, it's much easier if it's not working out to part ways with that company, and it's more understood that that's something that's going to happen. It's not so dramatic or dangerous in general. I mean, there's certainly contractors that have been absolutely caught unawares and really had a bad time after being cut from a contract. But if you're a contractor, you need to be thinking, I don't know if I'm going to get another contract, and I don't even know if I'm going to get to the end of this one. Where if you're a full-time employee and you get cut, it's much harder on you. It's a much bigger shift. So I think there's a bunch of reasons that aren't just it's cheaper, because sometimes people co-dev with very expensive individuals who have a lot of specialized expertise, and that's where if you're a small core team and you don't have the capability, you might pay a lot of money for someone who does have that capability to come in, do one particular thing really, really well, and now you don't need that anymore, and your staff can sustain whatever it is they did, and you can say thank you, here's a pile of cash, but I don't have to pay you throughout the development life cycle of the game. So I think it's a lot of it. It comes down to money, but a lot of it comes down also to I can keep my core team small, and that gives me a little bit more. It allows me to be more nimble. Downsides to it, and you kind of mentioned this in the second question. What issues do you see this posing for coherent design and production if there is an increasing reliance on external development partners? I'll say something that's unpopular, but I think I've probably said it before. Some of the same things that happen when you do remote work. If you co-dev with somebody that's not co-located with you, now you have to deal with the fact that you're in two different places. That makes everything harder. Remote is something that experiences this when you're all in part of the core company. You're all full-time employees, but fully remote. It can be harder to maintain alignment, to have the right conversations. Everything can feel formal, and there is something lost when it comes to rapid collaboration by default. You think you can overcome that by being really deliberate about it, but it's sometimes we aren't trained to be deliberate about it, maybe is how I'd say it. So when you're co-deving, that is even more extreme, because you're not just trying to make sure you're staying aligned with people where you have to be very deliberate about something that perhaps you used to not have to think about as much. You are also dealing with contrasting cultures, leadership, et cetera, et cetera. you have to some extent different incentives when you're trying to make a game and they're trying to be a successful codev studio. There's a difference there, and that different incentive can play out in the way that the games are developed, and it'll come in subtle ways or in big ways or whatever it is. So you want to keep an eye on that. You want to make sure that you are, as best you can, including those co-developers in your development, integrating them onto teams, making sure that you're being pretty transparent with them. But that's higher risk. And with differences in culture, it can also not be understood well and be misinterpreted or misused. When you go into different cultures, that same thing can happen. So a lot of times, this is something I think is true for some extent, also for remote work, but you didn't want this line of expenses, like this was the one line, when I hire everybody in the United States where it's really expensive, and this is my 2 line of costs over time when I hire codev. The problem is that if I may, what I'm hoping is that, well, if I'm paying this much, hopefully I'm getting this much output out of both, and see, now this delta's all win, right? Well, kind of, but actually what I think happens is you don't get that line. You maybe optimistically get a line something like this. And so this is still win, but it's not as big as you thought, and everything takes longer than you thought because you have to step twice as hard to maintain alignment and manage the difference in culture. And I mean that both in terms of business culture and potentially in terms of regional or geographical culture, like different cultures between countries and things like that. So yeah, I think that covers some of what I see. Another big issue is always that if somebody external comes in and integrates with your team, there's a security risk there. There's also, they now are the experts on something that's inside of your game, and when they depart, or if they depart, if they get a better contract and they take it, you might be in trouble as well, because again, you can get rid of them much more easily than you could get rid of a team of full-time employees. That's much less controversial, but they can also drop you if they get a better deal. And so I think that you're taking on a less trustful relationship generally, and you have to manage that. You have to manage that carefully. Question number 4 from Augustus. There are clear signs when certain aspects of a game are lacking: incoherent design, low quality assets, buggy software. What are the player-facing symptoms of a game that is lacking in production or leadership competencies? And to clarify, I appreciate this clarification, symptoms don't mean that it's that specific discipline or group's fault, but just an indication that the team should get curious about what challenges that group is facing / lend support. Player-facing symptoms of a game that is lacking in production or leadership. I'm going to probably talk about both of these sometimes. Sometimes I'm going to talk about leadership. Sometimes I'm going to talk about production. If you're lacking leadership, I think you have a high probability of not shipping your game, because leaders are the ones, formal or informal, that are saying, here's the goal, here's what we're trying to produce or build, or the vision we have, the player we're trying to reach and serve, the game we want. The leaders set that, and then they influence the rest of the organization to move towards it. So if you don't have leaders, you are unlikely to create anything coherent. And that's going to lead to you probably just not shipping your game. Even bad leadership that can set a direction might here be more useful than no leadership, which is a weird thing for me to say. But if you have, if you were just absent leadership, you don't ship the game. I think that's somewhat true for production, because production is primarily leadership role, but not entirely. You can totally have other leaders that'll step in and fill that gap. So if you're missing production competencies, there are studios that have shipped successful games that did not have producers at all. You see less of them over time because often that overstresses the discipline leads, and it's a crunchy mess towards the end that hopefully producers help you mitigate. But I would say that if I was like the player related impact of like maybe not having production would be something like the game is much later than we thought. If I've got production issues, if my production staff isn't doing their job, we probably are not able to set reasonable expectations internally or externally. If we can't set them internally, we can't set them externally. And that's going to lead to a lot of missed promises, whiplash, etc. That's going to annoy players. And so I think production plays that role. Again, both production and leadership, because I view producers as leaders, are that aligning function around this is where we're trying to go. Let's get there as rapidly as possible. And so though, like, yeah, you would see no game ever shipped or the game coming in late. I think the other thing that you'd see is a game that doesn't feel cohesive. So that focusing down and prioritization function that I think production and leadership does to say these are the important things and this other stuff doesn't matter that much. We need to focus on the most important stuff first, and then maybe we'll get to some of that other stuff later. You'd see games that have a lot more than they really need to be successful, that were probably much more expensive than they need to be. Maybe you planned for that, right? Maybe your production staff did a great job of laying out the big plan and you hit all your deadlines, building all this stuff that you didn't need, but the final experience feels like it's just got too much in it. It's like a random sort of, all the different features are bolted together, and sometimes it's almost hard to understand, like, what were you trying to do with this game? Like, what was supposed to be the experience? Because this feels disjointed. It feels like you just threw a lot of features and stuff together. And I feel like leadership and production should help keep that more focused, as like there's an experience we're trying to create there. We abstract from the stuff we're building to talk about here's the engaging part, or how we're going to emotionally hook players with what we're building. And I mean that in a positive way, hopefully. Those would be big things that come to mind when I think of like we don't have good production, we don't have good leadership. I think also you'd see a lot of difficulty scaling. And again, the manifestation of that from a player perspective, it's a difficulty in doing the right things when you need to be. So yeah, maybe that one comes back to it coming out more slowly again. Other things that would happen player side. Let's see. So I covered doesn't ship at all because leadership isn't there to guide people towards the goal. Is highly unpredictable even from a player perspective, and then feels disjointed, as if different parts of the studio were going in different directions, or we're just building stuff and hoping it all fit together in the end. I think those are probably the big ones that I'm thinking about. Okay, let's get into question number 5. This is another one from Kevin. Kevin asked a ton of great questions. Thank you, Kevin. Production organizations at larger game studios often suffer from issues of structure, such as a substantial number of producers, senior lead producers, and even lead producers, all rolling directly up into an overburdened production director, because there doesn't seem to be an understood space for a production manager, a producer manager, that sits between frontline production and executive/director level production leadership. What is the rationale for this gap when discipline manager is a well-understood conceit in other game dev disciplines? E.g., designers will have design managers reporting to a design director, artists will have department managers reporting to a director, engineers have managers between them and directors, etc. Is it just that production is typically not a large enough organization to merit managers? Is it that producers are seen as organized and not in need of more traditional personnel management? Okay, so Kevin is describing an organization where, let's say you've got somebody and they're like your production director, and then you have a slew of people where you've got like a lead producer, a senior producer, a mid-level producer, and an associate producer, and they're all just reporting into this one person. And as this scales, as you get more and more of these connected, this person gets more and more overwhelmed and their life gets miserable. So I know that this happens. I don't see this a ton. I see this some. Typically, I do see it in the case he talked about, where you actually have a very, very small organization. So it is just something like, I've got a PD, and there's only like 4 direct reports or something, and one's a lead producer, and 2 are mid-level producers, and one's an associate producer, and that's it. And they all just report into the PD. And we don't really feel like we need managers. We don't want to create a bunch of, like, oh, this person actually reports over here and not here, and it just kind of simplifies things to keep it when in a very small organization. In larger organizations, what I tend to see is you'll have someone, you'll have like someone like a production director, and they will have, in a larger structure, they'll have like again, I'm just going to go with the chain that he created for levels. Just a couple lead producers, let's say, and then they will each have, some number of senior producers, and the senior producers might actually manage all of your mid-level producers and associate producers and assistant producers and whatnot. Like this is sort of the base management layer, and then you kind of go up. And this person might report into the EP, and the EP, reports into the CEO or something like that, right? So I see this quite a bit in larger organizations with more production staff. Now, you're bringing up a good point though, and that is that when I'm thinking about an engineering discipline, what you'll tend to see is there's almost like three tracks. I think it's kind of, someone's going to shoot me for this in engineering, but there's like, if I think about an engineering team, they probably have a tech lead, and they probably also have an engineering manager. The engineering manager might not be part of the team, but all the people are on the team kind of are following the tech lead when it comes to practical stuff, but they're reporting into the EM. And so I've got just like a bunch of engineers, mid and junior and even senior, and their reporting line goes this way. These are a bunch of people in here, but they work with a tech lead, and so you have this distinction of, hey, this person, this tech lead, is a leadership track that might go towards, architect or something like that, or director of engineering, but the EM also can ladder up towards director of engineering, but almost feels like this is somebody who the engineering manager focuses on the people management side of things. And so there's actually this split at every level between, well, who's managing and who's architecting perhaps, or who's like leading the technology. You do not see this as much in production. I think so. I've actually had arguments about this, because I had an idea that I thought that there should be this split where every like, if you're a producer, you're probably going to start and you're going to be an AP, and then you're going to get promoted to like, a mid-level producer, and then you're going to get promoted to a senior producer, and then things start branching, and you might have a path of, well, I just want to keep becoming a better and better senior producer, and maybe we have senior producer levels like 2 or whatever, 2 through 5, I don't know, whatever it is, but you're not going up into more senior leadership layers. You're focusing still on teams and that development, and then you might have somebody else who's like, well, I want to actually manage producers, and so now you get a production manager of some kind. And sorry, that looks like product manager. I'm referring to production manager. But you can also go into the production manager space, and then I think and then on the other side, you have somebody who goes up and they become a lead producer, and then they become a director. And this was to try to capture the different possibilities that sit around, I think, where people actually have strengths and where they want to develop talent. The reason the people I was talking to didn't want to do that, they felt that, what do producers do already? Well, producers create the culture, they establish the processes, they lead the teams. The skill sets that they use overlap sufficiently with what people managers use that they should be able to do both. So basically, as you're going up the hierarchy in production, you're naturally accepting management responsibility, but that's very similar. Like, managing an individual isn't that different from managing a team. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's less of a Venn diagram overlap there than many people think. I think people management is its own unique and complicated ball of wax. And that is very different, actually, from leading teams. But I get that idea of this. There is more similarity there than it would be for a tech lead to an engineering manager. It is in both our leadership, both our managing and mentoring roles, these sorts of things. So that was the argument I got back, and they just basically said, So we want a dual hat. Basically, once you hit senior, you might start accepting direct reports, and especially once you hit lead and director and VP and all those different things, you're going to be. We expect you to be able to manage people. Again, I can make an argument the other way. I think you also have the other side of this, where it also depends on who you're asking your producers to manage. In some organizations, your producers are managing everybody, and that's quite a load. But in a lot of organizations, the producers only manage other producers, and then they have leadership authority over teams, but not management authority over the devs. And so there's a distinction there. And if that's when you only have the management responsibility of producers, you tend not to have as many producers, to the point that Kevin kind of asked this in there, is it partially because they're not large enough to merit managers? I think that makes sense to me. In a lot of organizations, you're not going to have sufficient managers to want to have a dedicated production manager who's not actually also leading some part of the org from the production lens. This can get more complicated because you can have subdisciplines of production in different places. Like some have a product-oriented branch and a more operational or development-oriented branch. You can have more than that as well. But yeah. So did I answer the question? Yeah, I would be interested to see larger organizations actually thinking more about the idea of having a production manager, because to get to this last part of the question, you said, are producers seen as organized and not in need of more traditional personnel management? Maybe. If so, that's incorrect. And one of the big reasons I'll give for this, because there are fewer producers, I've been the only producer in my subdiscipline in very large chunks, like in a 50-person org. I was the only one there who was sort of a development manager. And I was also the only development manager who had real context on what was going on inside of that whole space. So you can be very isolated when you're a producer. And I think even if we say, well, they're more organized, they don't need traditional personnel management. No, they need more mentorship, because artists tend to work with other artists. Engineers tend to be able to interact with other engineers. Designers get to talk to other designers, and there's a shared understanding of usually the problem spaces. It is more common to see producers isolated and operating in completely different systems than the producers around them. So managing them is one way that they get the mentorship and the support that they need to survive while they're the only production voice potentially in a very large group of individuals that are a set of teams or whatever. So I think I think management is really important. The other thing is, my view is that producers are force multipliers, and if they're bad, that means they're dividing your organization. They're making everybody worse, and if they're good, they're making everybody better. They have a huge potential to impact the future of the project. I think it's why some people don't like having production, is because there's if they're really good, it might be amazing, but man, if they're bad, they can hamstring everything. It doesn't matter how good your devs are. If you've got a terrible producer at the helm of a team, they will torpedo everything that's happening. And so some devs and organizations just like, I don't even want to deal with that. Just like, let's not have producers. And I get it. You're losing out on the potential upside to avoid the downside, in my opinion. But this is where I think like that management role is so important, because they are alone. You need to be training them. You need to be teaching them. You need to be staying in touch with them. And if the other downside of the model, both that you described, where the production director manages everybody, or what I've seen more often, I think, in larger orgs, where everybody kind of reports into some senior layer or lead layer, and then that sort of cascades from lead to director and director to VP and VP to COO. I don't know, however that goes. Yes, it's that in both of those structures, the people in charge, the people managing, may have another thing that's more important than their management responsibility. This is the real advantage to me of having a dedicated art manager or a dedicated engineering manager. This is somebody whose job it is to take care of the people, their tools, the craft, the discipline, not in some abstracted way like taking care of it on the HR side of how do we level and what's everybody's salary, but actually taking care of the people very directly within the discipline. And this can fall through in production. And that, if it does, it exacerbates that problem of the aloneness of the producer in their environment, which can lead to a lot of confusion and difficulty. Again, it's just like, hey, if I'm the production director for an entire game and I have to make all the, I'm bringing together all the roadmaps and I'm tracking all the reports and I'm making sure that our tools are working properly and I'm tracking to make sure we're all aligned and going in the same direction. I'm scheduling the meetings and I'm building the work system. And oh, by the way, I'm also managing 7 people. Most individuals do not put the same priority on that people management as they do on the rest of their responsibilities. And partially that's because they're incentivized to do everything else, not the people management. So something that I choose to do when I manage people is focus. I make sure that is on paper and in reality my number one priority. That is my main role that I do, and then my role leading the organization comes in second, and that's to make sure that I'm actually taking care of the long term of the people that report to me, their careers, and generally just the organization as a whole. Because I think if we drop that, if I start giving my management responsibilities lip service, you end up having you become a bad boss, and bad bosses are what ultimately will really it'll create a toxic organization. It'll create an organization that won't succeed over the long term. But it's tough. It's tough because there's so much to do if you're the lead producer running, a set of 7 teams through a whole distributed network of other producers. The idea that you're going to focus a ton of attention on managing those individuals it's not likely to happen without you being very deliberate about it. And you may not be treated well for that prioritization call, even though, in my opinion, it's the right thing to do. Question number 6 from Caleb. How can you become better at your role as a producer when you aren't at your job? Or in other words, how can you get better at what you do aside from getting more experience? Okay, how do you get better when you aren't at your job? Oh man, this is a tough one. One of the things I realized about both leadership and production, it's hard to get reps in because the decisions you make tend to affect other people, and you have to go build consensus or alignment or set up a system, and you have to see how it works, and that can take days or weeks or months to really observe and see how it all worked out. When I've developed other skills like becoming good at, way back in the day I practiced Halo 2, I tried to be really good at Halo 2, or when I tried to get better at soccer or rock climbing, you tend to be able to set up some sort of training routine. Maybe for climbing, it was like a strengthening exercise, or for soccer, it was, I want to get better at shooting. Okay, let me go find like a flat surface, like a big concrete wall or something, and I'll take a piece of chalk and put an X on it and then just take shots at that spot over and over and over. And I can get a lot of reps in a fairly short period of time in many things. Even in like Halo 2, you could focus on particular things or set up game modes so that you just practice shooting. I remember there was a mode that we would play where just both players had like an overshield that would almost instantly refresh if you ever stopped taking damage. And so you had to like hit someone and you had unlimited ammo and you just had to keep aiming at the other person for a very long period of time until one of you died. And took forever to kill the other person. But it really taught you to aim and really taught you to stay focused on hitting the head and aiming and aiming and aiming and aiming. But you could do reps on that over a short period of time. You could do a lot of reps. When you are a leader or you are a producer, you do not get to do many reps rapidly. And usually if you are getting to do a lot of reps, it's because things are kind of chaotic and going crazy. And so you're having to make a lot of calls and do a bunch of changes. And then you can't really tell what worked and what didn't because everything is conflated in terms of like, well, it went badly. Well, was that because of stuff inside my control, outside of my control? I don't really know. Or it went really well. Oh, well, was that because I made this change or this other one? I don't really know. It's hard to track it back. And so your ability to pick up patterns as a producer or leader, it's difficult. It's hard. I think it's one of the reasons we have many people who are in leadership roles or management roles or production roles who aren't actually good at it. Partially there's a training problem, partially it's a mentorship problem, but also just because it's hard to get reps. It's hard to see the patterns over time and be able to realize like this is what's working and this is what isn't. So what do you do besides just getting those reps, which will take a long time? Well, one of the first things you do is you try to find other people who have gone before you. And here Sometimes you can find those in game dev. Best book, I think I'd still say this is the best book for game development on the production side, is Clinton Keith's Agile Game Development with Scrum. I think is what it's called. I'll put it down in the show notes. Take a read. But also go outside of games, because actually there's not a ton of great resources in games. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, try to add more, but like go outside of games. Study how software development happens. Study how military leadership functions. Study how restaurants run or supermarkets. Go read a book by somebody who's made a successful restaurant chain and talks about their role as leader. And you're going to learn something that you can apply in your job. So I guess, there's educational resources that are all over the place when it comes to how do you lead well, how do you manage well, how do you get groups of people going in the right direction. Other books besides the one by Clinton Keith, Lean from the Trenches by Heinrich Nieberg. I hope I'm saying his name right, but I'm probably not. There is Creativity Inc. is a good one. Turn the Ship Around. Creativity Inc. is the story of Pixar. I think by Bob Iger, maybe. And then Turn the Ship Around. I don't remember the author, but it's a naval submarine captain. And like go find these things, study them. Now, reading about stuff will not be as valuable as experiencing it. So what I'd also say is figure out as you're reading things how to like find something that seems to be working. Don't just go and afflict your team with it. Don't just be like, I read that there's this cool different way that we could do a retrospective and just boom and like make your team do it. But you're going to find ways that they're going to teach you ways that are actually different, like things that you can engage around or subtle things that you might be able to get your team on board with. Maybe they do want a different retro and you can like ask them, hey, I learned about a different way to do a retro. It's something like this. Would you guys be up for trying that? Then try it, right? I hate to bring up the retro agendas or techniques as a great option here because I don't see them as that, but stuff like that, the little ways that you are going to engage with those you lead better, better ways to handle one-on-ones. There's going to be little tips and things that you can just integrate into your life and how you speak and how you interact with your team and how you interact with stakeholders, the problems you look at, how you think about risks. You're going to pick stuff up around that, and it's going to change how you lead and what you do. So books are one way, and then like apply what you're reading about in small ways to get the reps, to get the experience, because ultimately like that's how you're going to develop the sort of pattern recognition you need around production and leadership. And then you can also go to like training. There's courses, on the most super formal level. Maybe that's going back to college or taking college courses on organizational psychology or an MBA or something like that. I don't know if those will really pan out for you super well from an ROI perspective in game dev, but they could be helpful, and you'll certainly learn stuff. But find ways to engage with other like smaller training stuff. People mock the certification industry, and I think appropriately so, but some of it's good. Talk to other people, see what they actually recommend, and focus on the trainers that they recommend versus the certifications that they recommend. Because if you've got good trainers, they're going to teach useful, interesting things. And the cert is actually the far less important part. So find people who have gotten good training, and then take that material and see what again you can apply from it. Other one I would do, mentors. Find mentors, relate to those mentors, talk to them about what you're facing. Now, your manager should be something of a mentor to you for sure. But sometimes people in production are being managed by somebody who's not a producer, especially at smaller studios, or maybe that person doesn't have a ton of time to do anything besides really just the basics of people management. If so, find other people to mentor you. They don't necessarily have to be producers. They probably should be leaders. And they don't have to be at the company you're at. They could be outside of it. There are mentor networks. Maybe I'll put something in the show notes there as well, for you to follow up with around that. So let me see. So I've talked about books. I've talked about training. And again, both of that really comes down to figuring out what you can apply and actually applying it and trying it and seeing what works so that you start developing the pattern recognition and you have the experiences behind what you're doing. I think another one, and so then I talk about mentors. Another one is talk to peers. Get into discords with game devs, with leaders in game development, with leaders generally. You're obviously asking this question inside of the Discord, my Discord for Building Better Games, the Building Better Games Discord. That's the one I run. There's other ones. There's the game production community. There's game dev coffee. I'm going to look up. Hang on. Give me a second here. I'm just going to check, make sure I get the name right. What's it called? Game Industry Coffee Chat. I'll put a link to them as well. Talk to other people there. And be specific about asking people. Like, if you've got questions or things you want to bounce around, don't just like throw a question in the discussion. That might work. People might respond to it great. But also be like, hey, I want to talk to someone about this. And often you can find someone who's willing to give you half an hour to just chat through something, and you can get a different perspective at least. So those are some ways that I would say to become better at your role as a producer. Thinking more outside the box, I learned a ton about leadership being a raid leader in World of Warcraft. I've captained like intramural and very, very low stakes soccer teams. So there's other stuff. You can lead in the rest of your life as well, and get practice and get more reps. So those would all be things that I think you could focus on. Question 7. This is another one from Kevin. Another good one I've been discussing recently for mid and senior level producers. What does a career development track look like? Often it seems like the only future for a highly competent producer is executive producer, a stretch for many and not a realistic path for most, or production director, which itself is a rarefied commodity at larger developers. What are the progression opportunities an IC producer should be considering? So thinking through this, I think there may be more in the production space than there are in some other disciplines. Because engineers, you're kind of going to cap out maybe down like a principal track or an architect track. You've got engineering director, but all of those do exist for producers. So let me just start drawing. Like, okay, so you join the industry and you're an AP, right? Like you're an associate producer. Congratulations. Maybe you used to do QA or art, or maybe you're just fresh out of college, or you came from a different industry where you were kind of leading things. And then, so you drop into game development, you're an AP, you don't know what you're doing in the games, and you're leading, and you figure that out, and over time you get promoted, and you become a mid-level producer. And you're there for a bit, and now you're getting pretty good at running teams and getting them to good outcomes. You're getting a better handle on the tools. You're looked at now as somebody who's kind of expert in this. You've got some time under your belt. You've done some stuff. Eventually, that gets you promoted to senior producer. From senior producer, this is actually, I think one of the things that's interesting is production sits by default at the leadership layer in many parts of games. Not all, but in many. So when you're an AP, you are often a peer leader with people who have been doing game dev for a long time and are tech leads or art leads or whatever, right? So like this you're an AP, you're working with a tech lead. You're working with an art lead. They're your peers. They're who you talk to every day. When you're a mid-level producer, it might be that same thing, right? So you've still got your tech lead and your art lead. But when you're a senior producer, you're like, you're now partnered probably with an EM. There might be a tech lead or even an architect. You've got an art lead or even an art director next to you. And so you get this natural like bump because part of what a producer is doing is looking at the big picture. And in order to do that, they need to have that. They kind of need to sit at leadership layers to see what's going on across everything. They're not in that way dissimilar to an IC. It's rare to see a senior producer who's just like, yeah, I'm just focused on the same one team I've been on for the last 10 years. Usually by the time you're a senior producer, you've moved between some number of teams, or you've at least scaled up from the first team you were on. Now you're sort of leading the set of teams around that one team. So there's a different bit of structure there. This is gonna take forever. So after you become a senior producer, I'd say the default track, and again, I'm using a made up set of titles here that are fairly common, but not everybody uses them, and that's okay. You go up to lead producer, and again, org size grows, the number of peer leaders around you grows. From here, you either from senior producer or from lead producer, you're going to start seeing some branching options. And so, one, you mentioned like production director. I actually see this role a lot now. That's sort of a side shoot. It might be someone who is focused on the discipline or a managing role. But this is also sometimes just an embedded, operationally oriented role, and that's where it can also be called a development director. And so that's one path, and those might be the same thing, and they might not. Some studios probably have both of those. You can also become, like you were talking about, an EP, but there's not a ton of those. Now, here's the interesting thing about the EP. Depending on the studio you're at, the EP might be vision-oriented, like product and vision-oriented, or they might be very operationally oriented and paired with a creative director. If the EP is vision-oriented, they're often paired with a dev director, and producers might fill both of those roles, and they might both have a design director next to them. So you have these two roles, I think, that emerge. And as you continue to go up, this dev director / production director becomes like a VP of production that levels up to COO. And if you're an EP, sometimes you just stop at EP. Now, there's also something where this might be a side role from this, and it might break off the EP role. There's also titles like studio head or head, head of studio. I was just gonna say studio head or studio lead or something like that. That often producers fill that role, and they're sort of a blend of the operational and the vision, depending on the organization. Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other. And if it's more vision oriented, right? If you're an EP and that's more about vision, you might end up going up into still probably VP of production, but now it's actually going to be VP of just product. And then you become a CPO, if that exists, and both the COO and the CPO eventually become a CEO. Gosh, I hope everybody can understand all this nonsense that I'm writing. And for those, sorry, I'm using Paint for those that are on the audio only, but hopefully you're also able to kind of follow along with what I'm doing here. So yeah, like the track gets kind of complicated, and once you start getting past senior, lead, production director, executive producer, studio head, all of those are on the table. You might also go into discipline development. I was like a senior manager of production of the production discipline. At one point, that was a title I had. So there's like senior manager role. That was a little bit odd. I don't think most studios or publishers have something like that, but I was working at somewhere that did. So there's actually quite a bit of split. Now I'm going to add another layer of complexity and say that AP to mid-level to senior can also take a different shape, because I mentioned that I've worked as a development manager before, and there were two completely separate tracks. One was the development management track, and it was the operationally oriented producer, and a lot of traditional game producers kind of fall into that set. And I think there's a growing discipline inside of game development that is the product management discipline, which is more akin to what they have in technology to keep finding opportunities and staying aligned to the audience. But this is also very much a production-y role. And you see people, like I see a lot of product managers who their secondary skill set would be the operational leadership or the production or development management or whatever. And I see a lot of development managers or operationally oriented producers where their secondary is actually on the product side. So these to me feel related. And they're both like at their base leadership roles that will scale up the organization and again end up sort of laddering up into COO or CPO and eventually to CEO. Yeah, that would be how I'd answer the question. I don't think it's actually just executive producer. I think there's a lot more out there with director roles and VP roles. But yeah, you are correct. in that if it was, there's not that many EPs and not everybody's well suited to that. So I think most people will be able to find something else that they can do. The other thing to realize is that by the time you're a lead producer, it is not like being a principal engineer or a principal artist. You have often immense scope. And if you're a production director, which at larger companies they have a lot of people who hold the title of director of some kind related to production. You have large scope. The scope of what you're doing tends to exceed the scope of what your lead peers around you are doing. So you being a senior producer in certain organizations implies much higher responsibility, and actually the fact that like once you're there, you might never be promoted, and that might be totally fine. And that's the other thing I'd say: be careful about chasing your way. If you're just trying to run up this chain as fast as you can, you might end up Peter Principling yourself. Not totally bought on the Peter Principle, but like the concept of it, you may end up going to a role that you actually don't enjoy. You should be thinking about what you like doing and be careful about being promoted out of it. I remember hitting at one point in my career, I became a senior producer and I looked at the next level and I was like, I don't want to do that. My job, I get to kind of build the work systems and work with the teams directly and train the leaders underneath me. And this is all really cool. The layer above me spends all their time looking at profit and loss and budgets and playing politics and trying to get their, new hires for their initiative approved. And like, I did not want to be playing that influence game, engaging in the politics of the organization to that degree. And that's what I saw them mostly doing. So I was comfortable to like stop where I was and just become more and more expert and continue to add more and more value through gaining expertise. So be cognizant of that as you go up. Not, like as you said, not everybody's going to want to be an executive producer. That's okay. There are other places, or in the production track, you can stop earlier and it can be fine. Question 8 from Jason. As the only production guy on my team and one of 3 operations people, how would you deal with getting questions and answers when you have nobody around to rubber duck with? Rubber duck, I'm assuming it might be rubber ducky, whatever it is. It's this idea of, hey, I just want to like talk with you about what's going on and sort of bounce ideas and get to hear how I'm really great or not so great and what's going to blow up in my face. So this is actually pretty similar to the question that we answered earlier from Caleb. How do you get better at your role as a producer when you aren't at your job? But in this case, it's more because I don't have those people around me, those resources around me to talk to. So if I wanted questions and answers, the first place I would actually go are my peer leaders around me, even if they weren't producers. So you said you got a few other operations people. Great, you can talk to them. But who is your tech lead? Who's your art lead? Who's your QA lead? Your design lead? Your narrative lead? Talk to those people about the leadership side. They won't have a production lens perhaps, but they will provide insight. You don't have to do whatever they say either. You can talk to them. You can take into account what they're saying, and then you can run it through your own filters of what's good and bad. But if you did want to talk to other producers and they're just not available, one of the things I would look for is mentors outside the company. I would also hit up those Discords that I was talking about earlier. So there's Building Better Games Discord, which you're already in. That's the one I run. And then there's Game Production Community and the Game Industry Coffee Chat. There you could hop into a room in the morning and ask a question. You say like, hey, I got a question for other producers. Anybody up for, and whoever's there, they won't all be producers, but you can at least ask them and you'll get to bounce the idea around. Sometimes that can get tricky because you might end up with like, I need someone who I can talk to that's NDA'd. That is harder. But yeah, talk to the leads around you, talk to producers outside of the company. You should be able to find them. And like what I said to Caleb, find ways. Don't just ask the question blind in the discussion and hope that you get good responses. You may, but also just ask like, hey, I want to talk to a producer who's been in this situation about this. Anybody have half an hour they could give? I've just been so pleasantly surprised at how willing people tend to be to help out and like, oh, let me share with you my experience. The problem is they don't have all your context. They don't know the specific things you know. That is a weakness. I mentioned earlier that producers are often alone. You are particularly alone as the only producer at your studio. So yeah, engage with the people around you, leads. I would also say make sure you're talking with your team and just getting an understanding of what their expectations of you are over time. see if any of them are good people to bounce ideas off of. I have had great conversations with QA. I think I call out QA because I think I've had more great conversations about how the process and pipeline could work with QA than I have with any other discipline. And I've worked on all kinds of different teams. And it's because QA is at the end of the pipe and they see every step. They have to understand the game development lifecycle in order to do their job well. And so a good QA might be a great person to be talking to. They won't have some of the experiences you will. Another advantage of QA, they're often much more humble. And no offense to any other disciplines, but QA has been perceived and looked at as the bottom of the barrel for so long, they've internalized that. And so they're often more willing to just chat and not worry about it. And if you don't take their idea, they're not offended by it. Where I have run into that being a problem occasionally with some other disciplines. Sorry to those other disciplines. But you can talk to your team, co-leads, the operations people around you, find the producers outside, see if you can find mentors that are willing to just interact with you like once a month or on a topical basis when something comes up that you want to run past. And bring this up to your manager as well. See what suggestions they have for like, hey, is this something that I could do with you? Is this something I could do with, could you help me find somebody else to talk to or provide payment so I could get coaching around production or something like that. I don't know. There's different options you could look into there, but production can be a very lonely role. I feel for you, but there are things you can do, and I would say pursue those ways. Find those communities of producers and engage with them outside your company, and then work with the other leaders within your company. Question 9. From Nuka, when talking about the past, how can you learn to abstract experiences and look past the specifics? Are there any resources you recommend for learning how to tell stories so that you're not bogged down in the details of history? Sorry if that's really vague. I'm trying to keep it abstract. I've seen this question a couple times because you asked it a while ago, and I've thought about it a lot. And it's a tough one for me to answer. So I'm going to give you my best shot at it. One of the things that I want to acknowledge up front, I don't feel like I'm great at this off the cuff. So if I just pull a story out of a hat based on a conversation that's ongoing, I often feel like I don't get the right balance of detail to not detail to summarization in order to get the lesson across. And my tendency is to have too much detail. I am better at this when it's premeditated, when I'm pulling an example for a talk I'm giving or a course that I'm creating or a LinkedIn post I'm writing, and it's like there's a story, and I know what the point is, and it's easier for me to think ahead and go through, this is what I'm trying to communicate, so here are the relevant bits, and here's what I can summarize and sort of rapidly move through. And there's honestly, there's two different approaches that work with two different people. So I'll give you a model that I learned about, and this is, there's only two types of people in the world, those that divide the world into two types of people and those that don't. But this was one where Frances Fry, she's a professor at Harvard, and she did a talk at somewhere I was working, and one of the things that she talked about was this idea of how we communicate stories and points of stories. And there are, let's just simplify the world down to those two types of people. There are the people that she called they're the, oh dang it, wrong thing. They're the right side up triangle. And what they do is they start with the point. So they're going to start here, and then they're going to slowly expand out with all the detail. And this is, you start with where you're trying to go, you start with the end in mind, and then you add detail around that to sort of validate the point. This is a way that people communicate, and some people really prefer this way. I am the other way. I am an upside down triangle person, where I like to start with detail and context, and the point comes at the end. So I start somewhere up here, and then I work my way all over the place, and then eventually I get to like, okay, here's the point. The reason this model was helpful for me is that if I can imagine that there's people like this in the world, I recognize that they are incredibly frustrated by the way I communicate. And it's also why when someone communicates like this, I don't like it. Because I'm like, I don't have context, I don't have detail. Someone who does communicate like this, when I start starting with my detailed context, they're like, why are you wasting my time? What are you trying to say? And I'm like, don't rush me to the point. I got to give you all the background information so that you know by the time I get to the point that it's valid. So here's a simple model. That's a simple model to think through stories. Do you default into the detail context first and then eventually get to the point? Or do you start with a point and go to detail? Now think about who the other person is. People tend to like receiving stories in the same way that they talk about, the same way that they describe their stories. So if you're talking to somebody who tends to go detail context first and eventually get to a point, if you start with point and then go to detail, they're jarred and they're suspicious, and it's going to take you a long time to recover. And so you can actually shift your approach. And I've had this happen to me because I am so detail context first, then get to the point. But when I know I'm talking to somebody who needs me to get to the point first, I pause and I go, what is the point I'm trying to make? Let me start there, and then I can add detail, because they're going to ask me a ton of hard questions because I haven't given them the detail and context, but I can now add it after, and they'll be okay with that, and I need to be okay with that too. So I don't know if this is exactly answering your question of how you can learn from abstract experiences and look past the specifics, or learning how to tell stories. That's maybe a hint on how to tell stories so that you're not bogged down in the details. The problem is some of the details matter, and it's just about selecting which ones. So again, if it's off the cuff, I think it's just something to practice and get better at over time. I feel like I've gotten better at it. I still don't feel like I'm great at it. Yeah, and then in the first part, how can you learn to abstract experiences and look past the specifics? This takes time, in my opinion, and it takes time and it takes conversation with other people. Don't get caught in your own head around what are the lessons to abstract. Be talking to other people about what has been experienced, because they're going to tell you a different experience than you had, because even though you both went through the same thing, you have different lenses on it. And so you're going to start seeing, well, what are the shared things? What are the different things as I talk to a set of different people around the specifics of what just happened? And what does that mean I can abstract? Because different people took very different lessons from the same set of events. The other thing I would say is start with a base set of abstracted values and principles that you think is how you want to be, and then see how well that lines up over time with specifics. And I'll give you an example of this. When I was in the military, there was a very strong separation between leaders and their soldiers. You were to be respected, not liked. There was like a harsh line that officers don't fraternize with the enlisted, and vice versa. And I took that with me into game development, and it was this important principle to me. Like, yep, it's important to be respected. It's not important to be liked. What I found over time is that while there's a truth in that, actually I almost made it so that like it wasn't okay to be liked. I almost had to be not liked, and that was too far. And I found that actually if I could still be a human, still be like a coworker, a good coworker to someone, and know a little bit about them and let them know a little bit about me, and be a little bit more open and transparent, and not view us as an us and them, but actually view us as a together. I didn't have to be their best buddy or friend. Just being friendly, it was okay to be liked. I still think it's more important to be respected. And so I had this abstract idea, and then over a set of specific experiences in game development, I learned that actually, no, it's okay for me to bend this one. My principle is too harsh, let me adjust it. Because what you want is the specific scenarios that you encounter to constantly be informing the abstracted principles and values you have, and vice versa, right? Like so both of these feed each other. You're looking for your ideal, and simultaneously you're letting reality determine what is the best ideal over time. And so sometimes you're going to run into a set of specific circumstances and go, wait a minute, this is out of line with my values and principles, the abstract things that I hold to be good, and I need to try to resolve that. And sometimes you're going to run into a situation where those principles and values are challenged because they actually aren't as effective or useful or good as you thought they were. So again, you've left this abstract, so I'm giving you a pretty abstract answer. But when it comes to like learning to abstract experiences and look past the specifics, I think it's about reps, picking up the patterns, and then having something to compare it to. Have an idea of what good looks like in your own mind. So now you're comparing it to that, and then you're going, well, wait a minute, I thought that looked really good, but it actually worked out terribly. Is that because my abstracted ideal of good is wrong, or because there's other stuff going on here that I don't understand? And also don't lose the specifics, because they are the things that are going to help you teach others in the future to be better leaders and things like that. I'm always frustrated when somebody seems to be really intuitively gifted but can't actually explain anything about what they're doing, because it's dangerous, because basically they're relying on their gut all the time and they can't rationalize it. And at some point that is going to fail them and they're going to get in trouble. So I want people thinking about and like pulling from the specifics to the abstract as much as they can. The other thing I would do too is similar to the folks that I talked to about like mentors, reading, stuff like that. Go read books about other people who have been through leadership challenges. What are their abstractions from what they've experienced over time? See if you can pull from people who have done the reps in leadership before you, to again inform your abstracted models. Humans are we're too good at pattern recognition, but it is a helpful thing, and you're trying to develop good judgment because that's what leaders need. Producers are leaders, so there you go. Hope that's helpful. Gives you something to work with. All right, our last question from Il. Something I've been wondering about is how are game developers selecting and setting up test groups to see their players are enjoying the game and it's a good market fit? Are there aspects of this process that could see refining and improving, or common pitfalls other developers tend to see in this process? I left this one for last. Maybe it's a bad last question. I don't have high confidence in my answer to you, so I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief. There are people that I would go to before me to talk about how you assemble groups of players. People who, if you have a community, your community managers might be a place to start with this in an internal structure. If you don't have community managers, you start with devs. You start with your own devs, right? The team? You become playtest group number one, and then you're probably going to have some amount of friends and family that can be set up to run. I mentioned earlier, those aren't totally trustworthy. There's a lot of bias in them. There's a bit of drinking your own Kool-Aid that's going to happen within your own dev team, and there's a bit of a bias towards being positive from a friends and family group. So you have to just take it with a grain of salt. When you start going outside of that and trying to find real players, I know there are third-party groups that do this. Two names of people who have done a lot in the playtesting space before that I would refer you to are Steve Bromley and Graham McAllister. I will put links to their LinkedIns in the show notes so you can find them. Steve Bromley's also written a book, I believe, on user research and user testing. But there are organizations, there's like companies that do this as a sort of external contractors. They will set you up with players for the types of players you're looking for, and I think the best ones will even help you understand who those players should be. So yeah, I don't know exactly, outside of setting up a community fairly early on and then using that community as testers, which I think is a good idea. The problem there is you get not as much, but still some of the bias that the friends and family group experiences, because if they're in your community and they're investing and like spending time talking about the game and they're always looking at your updates about it and all those sorts of things, they're going to be a little bit more positive. Some of them will be a little bit more positive. They'll at least be biased in some way, maybe is how I'd say it. So to get like a truly neutral group of players, I would look to some other people besides myself on how to set that up. And again, if you have them, community managers might be somewhere to talk to, or see if anybody else in your organization has expertise on that. I just have very low it's one of those problems that I never had to personally solve. So if I did, I'd probably talk to Steve Brownlee and Graham McAllister if I could read their book. Okay, so are there aspects of this process that could see refining and improving? I guarantee there are. I don't know what they are. Common pitfalls other developers tend to see in this process. Okay, so I will talk about this one. Most common pitfall when setting up test groups to see if players are enjoying the game and if it's a good market fit is not doing it because we don't know how. This happens way too much. We think user testing is important. User testing. We want to get a play test. We want to get a prototype out. We want to get in front of players. But we don't actually know how to set that up. So instead we just play test internally, or we do the friends and family thing. We don't actually get it in front of real players in a way that's useful. Maybe we run like one, 90-minute session and hope that that's good enough. Not doing it, I think, is the biggest pitfall. The second one after that, and there's some speculation here, but some of this is informed by the conversations I've had with people who do this, is doing it without real intention. Just thinking that if I get a group of people together and throw them in a room and hand them the build, like, oh, cool, you're now playing the game, here it is, blah, blah, blah. I made you sign an NDA, and now play the game. And then like, okay, what's your feedback? And I send you a feedback survey, and I'm like, I did user testing. Not actually really giving any of the process rigor besides getting the people in the room. If those aren't the two biggest pitfalls, like again, Steve Bramley and Graham McAllister would know more, and there's others. I just know them more than I know most. But there's a lot of people that specialize in this. Those are the two that are scariest to me. And again, the reason why is often because I just don't know how to do it, so it gets lost because I've got a million things I need to be doing. And even though I know this is important, since I don't know how to do it, I'm going to do the other things I know how to do. This is a big mistake because you're not dealing with the unknown unknowns. You're going towards what you know and you're solving it. In certain fields, this is called like bike shedding. You're going towards the thing you know when the thing you don't know is actually what's going to kill you. But because you know it, it's more comfortable, it's easier, you feel like you can make progress. Where to go and start to figure out this problem and have to read a book and chase someone down and find out who a good third-party company is to support you in your endeavor, like that all feels like too much work and too much effort and too much, and like I could be getting so much stuff done instead of doing all that. But the problem is the most important thing you need to be doing is getting actual real players in front of the game. So common pitfalls, that's it. Not doing it at all, or not doing it with any rigor and just like checking the box. So avoid those two things. Make sure playtests are happening. Okay, I think that wraps us up for the first Q&A episode ever for Building Better Games. Thanks for listening. A special thanks to Kevin, Augustus, Nuka, Caleb, Jason, Il, and Philip for sending in questions to me. I actually quite enjoyed this, and I'm really curious how sorry for the people on audio that I was using Paint some of the time. You can find it on YouTube if you want to. Hopefully it was still understandable. But yeah, I enjoyed doing this. Maybe we'll do more of it in the future. And I think I'll wrap for now. So thank you. Did you enjoy this episode? If you did and are looking for more conversations like this one, join the Building Better Games Discord community. It's for leaders and producers in game dev who are frustrated with solving the wrong problems and who want to share experiences and learn how to lead and build better games. Check out the show notes to join. I'll see you there.